Okay, so next we have a couple little hair demos. I'm going to start off with sort of roughly referencing this picture here. So I'm going to begin, I've lightly drawn in some of the coils like they're falling similarly. I like to block in my shadows just like I do in watercolor. I picked up my kind of angled, very small sash brush. I'm quickly going to realize I don't much care for the way it moves. I'm adding a little bit of medium to keep it moving. You can also just use water for this. It really doesn't matter if it's medium or water at all. We just want to be able to make longer, thinner strokes. So I switched very quickly to a small pointed brush. Adding shadows, you can be a little bit, you don't have to be too precious about it. We're going to go over this with a lot of different layers, and it's acrylic, so they're not going to show through as much as they would if we were doing it in watercolor, but be a little careful with it. Because I'm using water and medium in it, I'm able to get nice thin points, but I'm also losing some of my punch with the color, which I'm entirely fine with. I'm using a darker color than I probably actually want for these shadows, but I'm acknowledging that once some layers have gone over it, they're not going to look so dark anyway. So I'm making variation between some thicker shadow points, some heavier lines, and also some little thin ones. I think that's always important when doing hair, is picking out areas where there's big chunks of shadow, like maybe where it falls under the chin or where it's falling behind the face, but also some that are just little areas where it's like tucking behind a little lock or showing just the way that is shaped, that little curl's turning away from you versus shading a whole section of the head, something like that. I've mixed some red and kind of neutralized it down just a touch. We're going to add this to just pop up a few colors. It looks really, really bright, really heavy compared to the research image right now, but don't worry, it's going to even out. This just has water in it to make it dance a little nice, which is allowing me to get really nice, really thin little points because it doesn't have any density to it, which even the medium adds some density, so water lets me get really, really thin. Rinsing out my brush and switching for water and yellow. I'm using a mix of ochre and the bright yellow to kind of get a nice bright tone, but also not too bright. I'm applying it pretty much to all my highlight areas and the tops of my midtones. One thing when painting hair, similar to when painting fabric, keep your brush moving in the same direction as the folds of the fabric. It makes blending so much easier. I don't want to move my brush against, perpendicular to the way the hair is flowing. I want to keep my brush moving along with the hair. I would say the only time that might change is if I were painting a lock of hair and I want to do maybe a very bright highlight that was going around the edge of a curl specifically, then I might switch and go perpendicular. There's always a break to the rule, but for the most part. So that's pretty dry. Luckily, I'm working on top of Bristol. It's absorbing as I'm going. Very, very handy. Here, you could use water or medium. Water would have less control. I'm going to use medium because it keeps my pigment suspended a little bit longer. I get a more even coverage. We are going to do a glaze on top of this. So the difference between water, it moves a little bit more. It doesn't stay exactly where you put it. Sometimes it drips, it moves a little bit, or the pigment kind of settles out to the edges. By using glaze, I have a little bit more control. It stays where I put it. So I've mixed just a touch of color into it. You can see this is how opaque it is. And we are just going over everything. It's a unifying stroke. The idea here is to get just sort of everything settled in together. We're going to go back over this another time or two and build up those layers, but this gets us to a nice happy point. Since there is lots of medium in this is not going to dry as quickly. So I'm going to get this nicely covered, get kind of to a good spot. We're going to hop over and begin work on a second hair demo just right next door. So while that is drying, I'm going to start carving out some locks. So I like to start locks by kind of sketching in. We're just going to do a couple across the front, the face framer ones. I've chosen the medium color of this, so not the highlight, not the shadow, but sort of the local color of the lock. I like to kind of make sure I'm using a little bit of a hesitation line as I'm going through it. It's not too smooth on the outside. So we're showing how the hair is like wrapped, how it's been twisted in. We're just going to do 3 locks here. 1 on the right side and then 2 that are sort of stacked together on the left, so you can see. And then I'm going to stipple in the hairline in between them, which is how I'd kind of blend them together across the hairline, and where we see, like I also do that where braids in between. We don't have like baby hairs or anything in this reference image, but you could add those too. So right now this is going to look like one big lock on the left-hand side, but we will differentiate them and make sure it looks like 2. Sorry, you can hear Yuki. So I'm picking out sort of what brushes I want to use, that's what I was reaching for, and also what colors I want to mix. So I'm pulling up into screen here so you can see we're going to mix kind of a highlight color, almost a highlight color, like a 1 step up, not quite a whole step up, 1 step up, and just pat it in. We don't want really smooth strokes along this. We want sort of interrupted strokes. I've got a filbert, so it's got a bit of a rounded edge, which is helping. And I'm just sort of patting it in and then pulling ever so slightly into the front edge. Like I said, this is really not quite even a highlight. This is really like 1 step brighter maybe than my mid-tone that I painted in. And then on the right-hand side, where the hair is being highlighted more at like a 3/4 view than a side light, I'm using it to also angle across more straight across the front of the lock. It's not so much a side light, it's more across the front and showing how the hair is actively like wrapping and twisting, giving it more dimension. Now I've switched and mixed a little, there's a lot of blue in this research image just based on the light. So I've mixed some blue into a ivory black, which already has a blue base in the black. And I've gotten a very small, stiff, flat head brush, and I'm using that to pat some of that deep shadow into the inside of the left-hand block. Once again, using it to sort of like, it's not quite stippling because we're doing it pretty wet, but it's like patting it in. The colors are pretty close together, so you don't have to be too controlling about it. The colors are gonna kind of naturally blend together, especially as they dry. They're closer together than they look. You can see already the one on the right, you can see that nice texture. You can see how the highlight's helping it feel like it has some like wrapping. I'm using this shadow to start adding some of that directional wrapping around this side as well. This brush is like a boar hair brush. It has a really, really stiff and like broken kind of texture to it. It would be awful to try to lay down like a flat brush with, but while the paint is still wet after I've applied it, I can use it dry to sort of stipple it back in. So if I've nicely put down kind of a layer here, if I take that brush and then just sort of dry tap on top of it, it kind of settles it in, it breaks it up, it makes it feel more organic. So I'm trying to figure out, cleaning off my brushes here. We will hop right back in and we're going to pick up a new color. So brushes have all been cleaned. We're going to hop into more of a highlight color. So I'm going to mix, it's like I said, the light in this is a little odd because it's got a very blue tint to it. So we want to mix a neutral that is ever so slightly like green-blue leaning for this like hot highlight. Highlights in hair always feel really bright when you are painting them. But hair by nature has like a translucency to it that helps reflect light, which is one of the reasons like we can think about painting it similarly to something that has a really reflective surface. So that's close to the blue on the outside, the really, really bright one that we're seeing kind of on the outside edge of this one. But we also want to be able to paint something that's more like a neutral, but like bright, almost green. So I'm mixing a little bit of a brown. I've got an umber in there. I've got a touch of blue and a little bit of yellow. And then a lot of white. And my white has so many things in it at this point because I'm not a very clean painter. I also have a little bit of water mixed into this paint, which is going to help it go on very thin. It's going to help me have a nice little kind of quiver to the end of my brush. It's going to make it a little more organic. This is the green I'm going to touch into it. And then it's going to help it dry a little thinner, so it's not going to be so punchy. If I put it on all the way pure, it wouldn't blend into the paint underneath it as well, but with a little bit of water in it, it's going to go on, and when it dries, it's not going to be like, woo, that's a lot of highlight. It's going to kind of settle into the underlayers. So if you're ever like unsure of the highlight you're putting on, if you're like, whoa, this seems bright, like see where I just tested? It seems very bright. But we're going to put it on with a little bit of water, and it's going to look kind of bright. It's going to be better. It's okay, don't worry. So you can see I'm kind of putting like little hesitation marks, like little tiny hair marks, and then I'm going to pat them in with my finger so that they multiply, like tap, 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 and then that multiplies them and smears them. So I get more for my money, but also so they are less intense. Some going different directions, some crisscrossing, but all focused on where the light is hitting across this like center front of the hair as it wraps. And then on this side, we see it more at the very outside edge. And we can be a little bigger about it and a little bolder about how we lay it down because we know we're going to go back over it and have a little bit of that blue. You can see in the pan, it looks very green. When it's mixed in here, it really does blend in and just read as kind of like another paler gray. So it's always a matter of like what it feels like next to the other colors versus what it looks like on your palette also. Now we certainly could stop here. We're going to add a little bit of the blue just because it's in the reference image and it's kind of fun. But we certainly could stop here. This is probably the more realistic, especially since we are not painting the full light or the full room or whatever, but it's just fun to add the blue. So why not? So here we go. I've got a little water mixed into it, so this is almost more like a thin glaze that we're putting on the top. I'm stippling it in, I'm patting it in that same kind of motion, so it's not very solid, it's kind of interrupted, and I'm hoping it'll dry down with a little transparency. If you wanted, you could also take colored pencils to this and add some really controlled little line works on it. Sometimes colored pencil can be a little hard to get on top of acrylics. Sometimes it sticks pretty well. It just depends on like how thin did you work and how shiny are your acrylics. Since I'm working on top of Bristol, these are pretty smooth. If I worked on top of watercolor paper, they'd have a little bit more texture for this to bite on top of. but sometimes it's a nice way to add just a few little tiny highlights. They're pretty subtle. You can also take a little bit of white or a little bit of something and add a little bit more stipple with that stiff brush if you're interested. So we're going to hop back over here and do some more blending and highlighting to make this a little more realistic, tone down how much contrast we've got. So this, where we're at right now, feels just a touch choppy, feels a little intense for what we're interested in. So let's add back in our highlights that we've sort of nixed. Right now we've got a lot of low, we've got a lot of mids, we do not have a lot of high mids, we don't have a lot of highlights. So I've got white on a very thin kind of rigger brush. I've got a little bit of medium in it to help me get some travel, otherwise I won't get very far even with a rigger. So I've got a little bit of white. You can see it's a little translucent. That's okay. We don't need it to be super punchy. We just need to raise the general value. When we glaze back over this, whatever is high value, whatever is white is what the glaze is going to stick to and feel the most punchy on top of. So especially when we're painting with something like an orange glaze, when it goes on top of something like white, it's going to stick to that. It's going to get the truest color payoff, just like going over white paper versus the things underneath it. Those things, it's going to keep building up the value there. So I also have a little bit of yellow. We're going to paint over some of our shadow areas and kind of dim them. Bring their value up and also calm them down. I'm missing some of those red tones. We lost some of that in this pass, so I'm going to pick and choose a few areas to bring those back in. Just want to make like a big shadow area here, so I'm kind of roughing in what the face shape would be so we can look at what a giant shadow area would look like. So I've gone ahead and let that dry so that we can go over it with this glaze. So I'm mixing up another glaze. This one has a little bit more yellow in it and it's very thin by comparison. So this one's mostly glaze, just a little bit of paint in it so that we're going to see the stuff through it more. It's more transparent. And you don't have to always glaze over the whole area. If there were something that I wanted to show more texture through, I could obviously leave that spot unglazed. That section could remain entirely unglazed. If I just wanted to dim one area, if I wanted to apply just shadow to one area, that would be fine. And I don't have to allow glaze sections to dry before I keep painting on top of them, so I can kind of work wet into wet. That glazing medium will help me kind of keep things blurry, which is nice, so I can kind of work some highlights into them right now while it's still wet, and they will just blend in. I often use glazing like that over certain areas to put in shadows. If I've forgotten them or need to put them in or something doesn't seem quite right, then I could just add shadows that way too. You can see this ends up with like what feels like mini layers. We get this effect of like mini layers of paint, mini layers of color, when in fact we only really mixed a couple. We've used the same 3 colors of paint, but by using different glazes and different layers of it, we've been able to establish multiple layers that when viewed seem to give us more depth. So I hope that that was very helpful. Good luck.